Hi, everybody. Welcome. Oh, I got it somewhere over here. I have my new toy, and it's now we're officially on air. I got that for my birthday, and this is big time. This is big time production here, you know. Uh, so, uh, the synchronicity gods and all these wonderful connectivity gods and Nanda Disu from Coriolis, a wonderful public relations firm. Everything, I don't want to use the word conspire, but everything conspired in a nice way to bring me with Chanchal Garg, who's a facilitator at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. So their number one, I guess the most popular course, Interpersonal Dynamics Learning Lab, if I got that right.
Yes, you
Uh,
did.
yeah,
You did.
more importantly, Chanchal is a very brave
Mhm.
person because she has written, and I started reading it. She has written Unearthed. This is a very powerful uh, the lies we carry and the truths they bury. So this is a deeply personal and beautiful and heavy memoir, and we're going to dive into that because it's really hard to write a memoir. I chickened out, by the way. Not that I have accomplished and stuff, but I didn't write a memoir. I wrote "There's a Tortoise in My Hair." It's not a memoir, but actually it kind of is. But your background and your life and your journey and the spiritual elements, we would just talking for a whole hour just to kind of get acquainted. I think I was doing most of the talking because I was so thrilled to have an audience. Uh, um, yeah, and and the spiritual elements, and of course, this becomes a spiritual undertaking. And make no mistake, there were energies I think came from your grandmother to do this, and Calvin's theory of life. So I'm so honored and thrilled to have a Californian, from Stanford. I said to Chanchal before we went on air, Stanford's one of my favorite universities because they embrace perfection in everything they do. And I just talked about it the other day with a student I'm mentoring. Uh, their planogram. They excel in everything. Football, basketball, sports, athletics. Women's sports, men's sports, academics, research. It's a wonderful model. Anyway, you're here. And I really thank you so much for being so gracious in your time. And we're going to talk about you. We're going to talk about on Earth. So I'm done. Monologue over. If you want to say a few words of
Yeah.
background, and then we'll jump in.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Calvin. It's been a pleasure getting to know you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Good, good, good.
Yeah.
So, your memoir, and I hold it up again. Unearthed is deeply personal, and I just said it. It's really brave. Uh, so, what inspired you to write it now, of all times, and in the writing process? Because I did something similar, but not like you. But in the writing process, you teach things about yourself. You learn things about yourself. So, why
Yeah.
now?
Yeah. Well, so Unearthed, it's my memoir, as you said. It's my journey through spiritual and sexual abuse, a lot of the healing that came from it. And when I first started writing, I don't think that I really meant to write something to publish. It was just like a journal for me, for my own healing. I did want to share it with my children. And so if I really look at the main inspiration for my book was my children. And that's because when I look at my own lineage, especially my maternal lineage, I would say I've watched women stay silent. I've watched women who have not even been able to acknowledge their own existence. And I didn't want that for my children. I wanted them to have a model for something different. I wanted my daughter to see something different. I wanted my son to see something different. And I also wanted them to know who I am. Because when I look at my parents or my grandparents, I don't know a lot of their stories. And I think they feel a certain pride in withholding that. And so that's not what I wanted. So I wanted them to know that was one. And then beyond that, when I look at my own story, and even as I was writing and I started to realize all of these different narratives that I had been handed, right, that I had inherited, that were no longer serving me. And I had to find my way through them to come up with, something of choice for myself in terms of how I wanted to look at the world, how I wanted to show up. And as I was coaching women, as I was facilitating, I was seeing these narratives everywhere, right? Like my story is extreme, but the narratives and underlying themes are pretty universal. And so as I saw that, I thought, it's important for my story to get out there because I don't want people to feel like they're alone. And I want people to know like this is something where many, many of us are struggling with. And there is another side of it, and there is a way through. And it's always, I think, more pleasant to do that together than it is alone. So, yeah.
So you grew up as, quote, a dutiful Indian daughter in America. So how did that dual uh, cultural identity shape your beliefs about authority and womanhood and belonging?
Yeah.
It's a tough thing with the dual.
hmm Well, I think, when I look at how I was raised, I was definitely raised to be dutiful. I was raised to believe that my job was to serve a man or to serve my husband. Um, I remember my mom telling me at one point, as a child, a woman or a girl belongs to her father. And then when she grows up, she belongs to her husband. And then if ever her husband should pass, she belongs to her son. And I always say the question that I wish I would have asked at that point was, when do I get to belong to me? And so that's how I was raised. But yet, I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana. So I was raised in this country. And so I'm going to school with this certain narrative that I'm being taught at home. And then at school, I'm being taught to express yourself and be independent and, be bold and all of these things. And I think there's a certain part of my own innate self that has also always wanted to be bold. And so you can see how those narratives clashed in many ways. And I think, as a child, it became almost a point where I could be bold in my belief of who I was supposed to be as a woman. So I was bold in the belief of like, no, I want to find a husband. No, I want to serve God. No, I need to respect authority. I need to do all of these things. But then as I grew up and, as my story shows, it kind of bit me in the butt, right? And so as I continued to do that, whether it was my first marriage, which was really abusive, the abuse that I endured at the hands of this so-called spiritual teacher, and when I finally came to terms with all of that, and it was like, well, wait a minute, these narratives are actually not serving me. Then I could find my own boldness and I could sort of rewrite these narratives based on what I believe. And what I've also realized over time is, like I think I had this false belief that loyalty or that my silence equaled loyalty to my culture.
Wow.
Like if you sweep it under the rug or, you don't talk about these things because that makes the culture look bad. And I think what I've started to realize now is like, no, actually, that's the worst thing I could do.
Mm.
And to speak up and to shine a light on these things allows us to talk about it and allows the culture to evolve, which is, I would hope,
Oh,
what we all want,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So,
No, it's interesting because I started reading Unearthed, and early on, so these pieces of energy within you was started at an early age because I remember reading you were with an authority figure, I forgot who, but he was tickling you.
mhm.
He was tickling you, and that bothered you at that age a lot, and you took that home.
Yeah.
So these pieces of energy were, they were there within you.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's the piece, right? Because one of the themes in my book is that, we live in this vessel, like we live in our bodies, and our bodies have so much wisdom. And yet, I think many of us, and especially women, are taught to ignore that wisdom, right? So I grew up with this teaching that your body's a temple. You've got to protect it. You've got to be vigilant, all these things. And yet, when I was with this elderly man who pulled me on his lap and started tickling me, and I was uncomfortable, and my body was clearly like, no, this is not okay. I'm 14 years old. And I go and I tell my father, then the response is, oh, he was just trying to be affectionate. And so then obviously I'm going to question myself and be like, well, wait a minute, my body is telling me that this is not okay, but maybe I misunderstood. So maybe I need to challenge the messages my body is telling me. Maybe I need to challenge my own inner wisdom. And so you can imagine over time, then that inner wisdom starts to get silenced, right? And it wasn't until I had my own children that I said, this cannot continue because I don't want to silence their wisdom. I always want them to have their own no. I want them to be able to say no.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Imagine, 14 to have, those receptors inside you to respond that way. Way ahead of the game.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So moving on, spiritual and sexual abuse are topics that, usually are silenced, and you kind of touched on this, especially if they're kind of faith-based, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, what gave you the courage to break that silence? And you just alluded to you have to do this for your children. Is that
hmm
part of the courage come from
It,
that?
that was a huge part of the courage. That was a big part of it. I think, um, my own need to heal, my own need to recognize like I'm dealing with all of this trauma. And I don't want it to just be trauma for trauma's sake. I want to be able to grow from it. I want to be able to give back to the world and contribute in a meaningful way. And so I think all of that was the impetus for it. And is it risky? Yeah, but it felt even more risky and even more problematic to not do it.
Brave, 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 brave. Um, in the book, I didn't get to it yet, but you just I'm looking at my notes. You describe a very, and I don't know if you want to fully clarify it. You want to, but you describe a very pivotal moment in your life when you're at a yoga class
Mhm.
and you're pregnant. Um, so can whatever you can take us to that particular moment, and
Yeah.
how did that become the start? One of my favorite words, transformation. I love that word.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I had a yoga studio of my own and I was teaching a class and it's kind of a funny story because I was teaching a beginner's class and there was a guy in the front row who was clearly not a beginner and he was popping up handstands and doing all these things and I was really irritated because he was intimidating the rest of the class and that's not what the practice is about. So I started asking questions to the class. I started asking things like, is your practice serving you? Or are you serving your practice? Or is your practice serving your ego? Like what's happening here? And those questions came from a place of irritation, but one thing I know from teaching yoga for many years is that the questions that I would ask as I taught a yoga class were usually the questions I needed to ask myself. And so I'm pregnant with my daughter as I'm teaching this class. And I remember afterwards going into the yoga studio bathroom and I looked in the mirror and I couldn't recognize myself. Like I was looking into my own eyes and there was so much um, distance and sadness, I guess are the words that I can use. And I had to ask myself, is your practice serving you? And it wasn't my yoga practice, it was my spiritual practice. And it was almost like, I don't know, it was like a lightning bolt almost like, no, actually, I'm not serving, my practice isn't serving me. And what's actually happening is I'm serving a man who's dictating what my practice should be. Right. And at the same time, like I'm pregnant with my daughter and I'm realizing like I'm carrying a girl. And it was almost as if there was a message coming from her, like, you need to clean this stuff up, you know? And so I think there were two things there. I think it was being pregnant with a girl. I think that I had started the physical practice of yoga with which, when you practice yoga, it's not like you're putting on a pair of headphones and trying to avoid the burn, right? Like that's not what yoga is. You're leaning into the sensation. And so you can't ignore the messages of your body. And so I think all of those things put together, along with this question that I, asked in a yoga class, sort of gave me this moment that I couldn't ignore anymore. And that was the beginning of me separating myself from that community and from the teachings and from sort of making my own declaration of who I needed to be and all of that. It was the start of a journey.
Yeah. Isn't it funny? I can identify with this because I had a spiritual thing on December 28th, a bunch of years ago. I weighed 350 pounds, and I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs, and I was dying, and I knew that. I smoked, and I didn't exercise, and 350 pounds, and it was actually July 21st, 1989, and I heard a voice, a little loud and clear, trust. I don't know where
Mm,
it came from. And it was early morning, and I I looked to see my wife was dead sleeping, and went in to see my son, and he was sleeping. So, and then the epiphany, I got to fix things, just like what happened to you, and
yeah,
you fix things, and lost 100 pounds in 2.5 months.
that's amazing.
You change things. So we're being dealt same kinds of energy. I find that fascinating.
Hmm.
It's fascinating. What's really good, I believe nobody doesn't have these antennas up
Hmm.
and out. We all have them, but most of us, are too busy doing TikTok and doing this, doing whatever. And so the antennas don't, it's a matter of having those antennas up to get stuff. All right, moving along. Moving along, boy, am I loving this. Uh, Particularly loving all of this because it's so enlightening. And and you can identify with some of this stuff in small ways, which to me, it's wonderful. Because I've been there in my own way, and it's wonderful. Um, so you did something really hard. You left your faith community.
Hmm.
And yes, it's liberating, but it's got to be painful. I know about that. Uh, what was the hardest part of actually stepping away from that? And how did you like rebuild your sense of self from leaving that?
Yeah. I think the hardest part was just not really knowing where I was going to land, right? It was the uncertainty of all of it because part of it was that I didn't really have any support. My parents didn't get it. Um, all of the people who were closest to me were a part of that community. My husband's response wasn't the best. And so it was hard. I was very much alone. I often say that rage and grief were my companions during that time, right? And while those don't seem like desirable companions, they taught me a lot. And so I think that was probably the most challenging. And all of the tools that I had to cope were given to me by this man and this culture that I now wanted nothing to do with. And so I separated myself from the culture for a while, and I've only recently started the process of reclaiming that. But yeah, I think that was the hardest, just recognizing like I have to do this on my own. And when I look back, I'm so grateful that I did because I think that's what gave me my sense of self, right? Having to do that on my own, having to recognize that no, actually, I have the power to do this within me. And like you said, we all have those antennas. We all have this ability to access the divine. We don't necessarily have to go through someone else to do that. And so starting to recognize that and force myself to remind myself that, even though I didn't believe it yet,
Wow.
and just trust, like you said, for years. That was hard. That
Hard.
was,
Oh, it's
yeah.
hard. It's hard. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, I'm laughing. Yeah, I came out of Rutgers and I was an award-winning note taker. So as you're talking, I'm taking notes. I don't know if you see me writing. No, hey, I got to do what I got to do. I'm taking notes.
Yeah.
Maybe I know Johnny Carson never took notes when he was interviewing people, but I do. So,
Hey.
so I thought the rage and grief are your companions was brilliant and
Mhm.
powerful. So I wrote that down. And if I ever use it, I'll give you credit. I promise. It's great. How do you define, Chanchal, how do you define unearth? Uh, how do you define unearth after living the
Mhm.
journey that you've been on and writing about it?
Mhm. It's a constant process. For me, Unearthed recognizes the process of looking at the way I'm living my life, looking at my beliefs, and asking myself the question of, is this really yours, or is this something that was just handed to you and you adopted because it was convenient? So it's that process of excavating who I am versus, who I was fed to be. And it's constant. It's constant because so much of our lives today, it's so full. Like you've mentioned social media so many times. And I think in this day and age of AI, things are getting faster and faster and faster, and it's becoming harder and harder to not go on autopilot. And so to be able to slow down and say, wait a minute, why am I doing this thing? Or why am I spending my time this way? Or why am I thinking this way? Or why am I saying this thing? Um, Requires a lot of intention and discipline. And, I'm not going to say that I do it all the time. I think it would be exhausting to do it all the time, but I try to do it as much as I can so that I can continue to grow and continue to come into who I really am and come into my potential.
And it's a wonderful journey, for somebody who's an octogenarian, and looking back, it's a wonderful journey, and it ain't over, and it's still, and I'm still discovering,
Wow.
who the hell I am. I still don't know, I'm still not sure,
Power.
still don't know, and I've got, many decades on you, and I still don't know, but get up every morning, and what am I going to discover today? It's nice. It's nice because if you take care of this mechanical thing up here, I call
Yeah.
it a mechanical thing. If you take care of it, when you're in your 20s and when you're in your 80s, it's going to work even better because I live under the umbrella of something called crystallized intelligence. And I thought that was kind of a new term. Actually, it's been around for like 5 decades. Crystallized intelligence is really whatever input I've taken in 60, 70, 80 years. And if the brain works really well, and it's not getting clogged up with Alzheimer's, dementia, all that stuff, then I can retrieve all the stuff I learned for 80 years. So it's all up there. And what
Mhm.
makes me particularly effective, of course, AI always comes into the picture now, but what makes me particularly effective, I get 80 years of stuff up there that I can retrieve pretty quickly. And
Yeah.
and somebody who's a sophomore at Stanford can only retrieve up to being a sophomore at
Right.
Stanford. And the other 60 years uh, I got. The other thing I wanted to mention, you mentioned AI, things faster. I coined uh, a few weeks ago, I forgot who I was talking to, but I coined an interesting thing. In my opinion, and I use 4 different AI programs, and the more I use it, I kind of recreate a scene from the movie Moonstruck with Cher when she slaps Nicolas Cage in the face and says, "Snap out of it." So I'm constantly slapping my face ceremoniously and snapping out of it to fully comprehend what the hell's going on here. It's like, wow, this stuff's
Jeez.
wow. I mean, and so, and what I'm saying is probably going to be outdated in 6 months. But our world, which I would tell students who I mentor, is changing every 15 minutes.
Hmm.
Used to change every couple of years, and now it's every 15
Yeah.
minutes. It's probably going to be every 5 minutes soon. But anyway, um, take a deep breath. I want to go off topic. I alluded to this.
Yeah.
I want to bring up my friend Barbara, not my friend, but an idol of mine, Barbara Walters. So, a couple of silly questions, but not silly. So, excluding, you don't have to answer it. You can, could be a couple of answers. Excluding family or friends, somebody living or dead you'd like to spend a day with.
Hmm. Someone I'd like to spend a day with. That's a great question.
It is. It is. Thank you, Barbara.
There's probably a few people.
Sure.
Um, so the first person that I can think of is Arundhati Roy, and she is an Indian woman. She's an author. And I think, in reading her work, I think she's extremely revolutionary. Um, yeah, and I really resonate with a lot of her thoughts and writing. Um, I think from the American side, like I really resonate a lot and have found her books from the very beginning really helpful. Glennon Doyle, who is also a podcaster. She does the podcast We Can Do Hard Things and has written several books. And I remember way back when she wrote Love Warrior, she was also very, she's also a very spiritual person even today, but she was very involved with her church and she also sort of had a reckoning. And I've been following her work for years and have always found a lot of comfort in her work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great answers. Great answers. There are no answers, but they're great answers. Yes. One more silly question. Do you have some favorite movies that you like? I'm an old movie person, so I always like asking that.
Yeah. What are my favorite movies? It's funny because my husband and my kids always ask me this, and I'm like, I don't know.
Oh,
Like,
that is funny.
but let's see, what would my favorite movies be? So I really love musicals, and I love. I mean, this is a play. It's not really a movie per se, but they've kind of turned it into one. Hamilton.
Yeah.
Really love that one. Also, really love The Greatest Showman. Thought that was a great one. Um, and this is a musical that is not a movie, but I'm going to put that in my answer anyway. It's what is it called? Yes, Juliet or And Juliet. And it's
Okay.
basically the story of what would have happened if Juliet didn't commit suicide just because Romeo did.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a great, great show. Highly
Wow.
recommend it.
Wow. I wrote that down. That's
Yeah.
so interesting. Um, it's funny you mentioned Hamilton. I did an experiment a couple years ago because I have all this. I have all the time in the world. It's like a line from H.G. Wells' Time Machine. I have all the time in the world. So I wrote Lin-Manuel Miranda. Actually, a real a snail letter. I actually wrote him a letter because I saw his address. It was a lovely letter. I said, "Hey, I'd like to interview. Just give me like 5, 10 minutes." And believe it or not, a few weeks later, I actually got a letter handwritten from him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I have it there. It was wonderful. It was so uplifting. And he thanked me. He says, I'm kind of busy. Duh. Duh. And he really appreciated my reaching out. And he said, please accept this handwritten letter as a token of my, regard, blah, blah. And it was great. It
Yeah.
tested my ability to write letters. So back to work. Back to work. Um, What does reclaiming your bicultural identity mean for you today? And part of that is balancing tradition with
Mhm.
authenticity and stuff. That's
Yeah.
important to you.
Yeah, it is. I think as a child, people were always sort of deciding if I was Indian enough or American enough or too American or too Indian or too this or too that. And over time, my idea of reclaiming is recognizing, I was born in the United States. Nobody gets to tell me whether I'm American enough. Like I was born here. I've got an entire lineage of Indian people. So nobody gets to tell me if I'm Indian enough. So when I think of reclaiming, it's looking at my culture, looking at my traditions, and looking at who I am as a person and getting to choose to say, how do I want to show up? How do I want to show up as in, like, what does being Indian or being an Indian woman mean to me? What does it mean to be an American woman? And so it's really about being in choice. And what I've found over time is, the traditions and the holidays and the rituals and all of that, um, while there's like this certain mindset of like, this is how it's done, and you've got to do it this way and you've got to do it that way, I've sort of taken the traditions and all of that and I like to say evolved them. One of my favorite examples of that is there's a holiday in August called Rakhi or Raksha Bandhan, where a sister ties like a piece of thread around her brother's wrist as a symbol of protection. And in the olden days, the brother would give the sister a gift or money because the sister couldn't earn back then. And the protection that the sister was offering was sort of like almost like protection from a goddess. If yeah, I guess that's the best way to put it. And so with my children now, when we do Rakhi or Raksha Bandhan, I have them both tie the knot, and they both give each other gifts.
Nice.
And so it's just a different sentiment. It's just sort of an evolved tradition. Like we're in an age where everyone's working, everyone's independent, everybody gets to be both a we and an I, you know. And so when I look at our traditions and our celebrations, I try to evolve them to reflect that so that they're relevant and they can continue throughout the ages. Because I think if they're not relevant, we might adopt them, but our children may decide that they want to let them go.
Um,
So yeah, so that's
yeah.
I would say an example of the reclamation for me.
Yeah, it's instilling. I watch my grandchildren, and because they're a mile away, there's so much interaction, and they sleep over here all the time, and it's fabulous. What I've
Yeah,
observed about the human species, what you put in, you get out.
yeah, so
Period.
true.
What you put in, you get out. The love, the this, the that. It's a wonderful thing. Um, I did have the great gift of going to an Indian wedding, and I saw the groom ride in on a horse.
Yeah.
Um, um, it turned out to be that plastic surgeon I tell you about his son,
Mm,
and it was just one of the most magnificent spectacles up in the mountains, and
yeah.
that it was wonderful, and partaking of the food, which I love because I don't do meat, and there's so much.
Mhm.
It was one of those indelible memories for me. Anyway, moving on. Let's talk about the fact that you've been a facilitator at Stanford's
Mhm.
graduate school of business, and you're facilitating this course, which is really, I guess, it's the most popular course there. You guide leaders in interpersonal dynamics, and um, how does your personal journey that you've been on show up as a coach and as an educator? Does that fill part of this picture? Uh,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate the question because a lot of times with the memoir, people can kind of look at that and be like, oh, that's your personal story and this is your professional one. But there's definitely a link. So, as I facilitate interpersonal dynamics groups and even coach leaders and things like that, I think one of the things um, that a lot of leaders struggle with is really trusting their own intuition, trusting themselves, um, saying the thing that's difficult, right? Or versus trying to soften it or even overcompensate and being stronger than you need to, and all of that. And I think when I look at my journey, it has been how do I how do I step into my truth? How do I speak my truth in a way that not only works for others but works for me? And so I think that that journey is sort of interwoven into this interpersonal dynamics learning. In from my book, From the Unearthed Journey, I have a framework that I've developed. It's basically a triangle. I call it the unearthed power matrix, where identity sits at the top, and then language and embodiment are the bottom two corners. And the way I think of identity is the sum of our lived experience rather than anything set in stone. And so it's constantly evolving, and we get to choose what do we want to focus on and what do we not, right? What do we want to let go of? And so that's identity. And then when you think of language, it's the expression of how are we expressing our identity, and an embodiment is how are you living that expression? How are you living that in your own body? And I find that the practice of interpersonal dynamics is exactly all of that, right? You can say the same thing, the same exact words in one embodiment, and it'll mean something completely different than it will in a different embodiment of it. Same person. And so I think a lot of it is that. A lot of it is, we often think that, or not, I would say it's a common perception that we have to choose either truth or the relationship, right? And that's such a false narrative, right? It's a false choice because you can speak the truth and stay in relationship as long as there's willingness on both sides to stay in the conversation
And to accept it.
and
No,
to accept
to
and to
accept
accept
it.
and to be kind,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so I think a lot of that is sort of the overlap in my journey. And I also think that the way we show up in our relationships and in our personal dynamics, work or home, has a lot to do with what we've inherited. What are the emotions that were okay as a child versus not okay? For some people, anger was not okay. For me, believe it or not, excitement was not okay. And it's so different in every household. And so, like, what emotions were okay? What narratives did you grow up with? How is it okay to interact with men? How is it okay to interact with women? All of these things. And I think when we start to really unpack some of that, we start to get clear on there's a lot of layers on top of this relationship that don't really need to be here, right? And if we can just meet human to human, how much closer might we feel? Yeah.
The way you say it just makes it's actually simplistic sense. It's so it's just so easy to grab and digest and absorb the way you're wording this. Hey, I always quote Aldous Huxley usually once a day. It is a brave new world, and listening to you, yeah, it is a brave new world, and unearthed as I'm plowing into it, um, which is a good segue. You have a real space coaching
Hmm.
that you do. So how do you help people break free from this? You kind of touched on how do you help people break through from their limiting beliefs? And because I'm sure some of that mirrors your own journey.
Absolutely. Absolutely, it does. Yeah, so I think, I work with a lot of leaders, as an executive coach, things like that. And I think a lot of the things that we tend to work on in our coaching sessions is just how they are exhibiting their own influence within their organizations, within their teams, and things like that. Managing people is hard,
Hmm.
right? Building
No.
teams is hard.
Oh,
And when we start to understand that every person has their own lived experience, and so you might say something with one intention, but the likelihood of your words landing on someone with the exact intention that you spoke them with is, I would say, almost 0%, because everybody's listening to everything through their own filter, right? And so recognizing that and saying, okay, how do we clarify that communication with each other? How do we build these teams? And then as we start to work on that in coaching sessions, starting to get really clear of like what's in the way. I work with people all the time and they're like, oh, well, I'm not the kind of person who can just say that. I'm not the kind of person who can, give feedback. I'm not the kind of person who can step into conflict. Well, who said that, right? When did you make that decision that
Mhm.
that's the kind of person you are? Right. So it starts to, I mean, I'm not a therapist, so I don't like to go back to childhood memories and things like that. But sometimes you touch on it because it's like, well, when did you decide that? And is that changeable? And if not, then, who said that, right? So it's just asking the questions. I don't claim to necessarily have answers, but I do have a lot of questions.
By the way, I think that's even better than answers, questions.
Yeah.
I just made that up. I think I like that. Questions are better than answers. I got to use that. I'm writing it down. I like that. I have no idea what it means, but I'm teasing, you know. Okay. What impact do you hope that Unearthed will have on readers, especially the women who've gone through similar struggles? And there's obviously armies and armies of women who've gone through similar struggles,
Yeah.
and even those people, who haven't shared, your background and stuff. But so, what impact are you looking for? I mean, in my brief time with this, there's impact like, oh wow, because you know what I'm in Jersey, I'm in New Jersey, and sometimes there's a kind of a bubble of you. And for all of us, people are just not aware, of so much of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say that's the first tip for people to recognize like this is not an isolated thing. It's pretty common. Um, Second of all, like I think I alluded to this earlier, healing is never done. It's a constant journey and I'm still on that journey today. And so I don't want to say I'm done with it, but I've done a lot of my healing. So I didn't write this book to be, as a trauma dump, for instance, right? Like I wrote it in hopes that people could see themselves in parts of my story. What I tried to do throughout the book is illuminate the questions that either I was asking myself in the moment or that I wish I would have asked. And so my hope is that as people read this and they look at their own lives, they can start to see what are the questions that I could be asking myself right now that might either help me get out of the situation or might clarify something for me so that I can be more of who I am as I go through my life. And so that's my hope is that people can see themselves in this story in some way, start questioning their own beliefs,
Correct.
start moving towards truth rather than what their families, cultures, organizations, countries, political groups, schools, what have you, are telling them truth is.
People
So,
need to see and read and hear. I write about in my unplugging 10 things I learned from the billionaire, which comes out in December. The messages and you're part of a message for people who are in that, the armies of people who are in that. But people need to hear, according to me, and what I learned from the billionaire, between 5 and 10 times something has to go through the eyes and to go through these two ears and get stuck when what I call the quicksand of learning. And one or two or three or four passages through here with for the eyes and ears, it doesn't get to the quicksand, but 5 to 10 passages through here, it gets to the quicksand, and it begins the process where you can say it's been learned, and that's Calvin's theory. If you could offer, an old question, if you could offer a piece of advice to someone who feels trapped by, cultural, spiritual, familial type things, what would it be?
so I think the first thing, at least for me, and the hardest step for me was admitting to myself what the truth was. Because that admitting it to myself shifted my entire identity, right? And so it was basically me recognizing that I had been living a lie. And that's really hard. So I would say if you can recognize and own that first, even if it's just with a piece of paper, it might not even be with another person at first. Um, know that that's a big step. And know that as soon as you start to hear yourself say what you're saying, and then maybe you get witnessed by one other person, someone you trust, your courage will grow naturally. And you might not believe that right now, but just trust that it will, right? Because it's almost like there's this voice inside of you that's been silenced, and it has to start trusting you that you're willing to speak. And the more it hears you, the louder it's going to get inside. And so, people say, oh, you got to find your voice, but finding your voice is not a moment, it's a muscle, right? And so you got to keep building it and trust and don't feel like you got to take giant steps. Baby steps, I think, are best, especially when you're dealing with things like this, because there's a lot of safety that's necessary to do this.
What I marvel at, this was, a journey you did on your own here.
Mhm.
This was one powerful journey, a brave journey, and we're gonna read and understand the elements of that journey. Not easy, in just small ways. I took my own journey. Uh, it's funny. I read about it, especially for a guy. In all my years on this earth, and I was on the road, full exotica, selling eyeglasses for 25 years. Not once in 25 years, and I predate this thing called GPS. So I used an old, I guess it was McNally, Rand McNally map.
Mhm.
But in my 25-year driving experience, I never once asked for directions. Oh, never once. If I'm lost, I'm lost. I'll figure it out. Of course, I was in a place that you can never get, Jersey can never get lost. Because if you head due east, you hit the ocean. You head due west, you hit the Delaware River, where Washington crossed over. So, but I never, so whatever I've done uh, to change, and I've done some changes, it was on my own too. So I tip my hat with my Einstein-like hair to you for having it's a tough, amazing, wonderful, gratifying journey that you've been on, and I truly can't wait to finish this, and I will. Uh, last last typical stereotypical question to ask you: what's next? You're a writer, you're a facilitator, you're a coach.
Mhm.
Do you have things that you want to do?
I do. I do. So I'm starting to lead my own interpersonal dynamics groups, just on my own. And I'm also starting to dabble in speaking. And so my hope is to get my message out there to larger audiences, speak on stages, speak on, to whether it's ERGs within organizations or organizations that support some of the things that I support. I would love to be able to inspire and get people to take action in ways that can change the conditions that our society lives in that makes this sort of abuse possible. So yeah, so those are things, and people often ask me if there's another book, and this one only came out in June, so I told myself I wasn't going to answer that question for at
Don't
least a
answer it. Don't answer it.
year.
Don't answer it. I finished writing Tortoise, and my wife, who's dying for me to take a ride with her on a Sunday afternoon, said, "No more, Calvin." I said, "No more." And then I bump into Kay Wagner, and actually, we have on the table to write six more.
Wow.
Yeah, six. Literally six. But the good news is I can bang this out, in a couple of weeks. There's so much inside you,
Hmm.
so much that wants to come out. So there's a whole bunch of, we'll see how it goes. But uh, I I'm an old movie person, and at the end of one of my favorite movies called Norma Ray with Sally Field and Ron Liebman, a true story. Sally Field plays Norma Ray, and she helps to do a unionization in the Deep South, and she interacts with this New York guy who loves reading the Times on a Sunday, and she's down south, and she doesn't do that kind of stuff. So you have the clash of cultures, huge chasm. And there's this tender little love story that never gets fulfilled. But anyway, at the very, very end, watch how I tie this. At the very, very end of the movie, as Ron Liebman is ready to go back to New York and his world and leave her world, you know, and they really do care about each other, but they're two different worlds that won't be able to be breached. He says, knowing you has been sumptuous.
Mm.
It's a great word. So this interview, Chanchal, has been sumptuous.
No, well, thank you.
And it's an appropriate way to end. But thank you, and I'm officially inviting you to come back. This thing
I
keeps
love
growing,
that.
come back, tour, whatever. Hey, do come back, and thank you so much for your time and being gracious. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Calvin, for
Yeah.
having me.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Don't leave. It's a 2-minute wrap.